So my name's Lisa Tilley. I'm going to be chairing this session. So really, really excited to be here with two really fantastic kind of galaxy brain rock stars as speakers. We're going to be talking about race and myth making. And the overall kind of premise of the panel, or the opening provocations, is this idea around race being a technology of power. And the panel really wants to look at, what's behind this really common refrain, how can we sort of understand what it actually means in practice. So we'll look at what's going on really in contemporary Britain, this messy container that we find ourselves in, and think about themes including nationalist myth-making, racist myth-making, particularly in an era of economic decline, where it's becoming easier and easier to create conditions of scarcity, where different groups are told that they have to fight over scarce resources. So we have with us Dr. Sita Balani and Dr. Sivamohan Valuvan. Just to introduce both of our speakers briefly, Sita Balani lectures in English at Queen Mary University in London. She recently published the wonderful book Deadly and Slick, really great piece of work, so make sure you go out and buy it or illegally download it from whatever site there is to download it from. It's published by Verso, and she also co-authored Empire's Endgame with a host of other, great people. And she writes and speaks regularly on themes including anti-racism and feminism and sexuality, and other important themes. Sivamohan Valuvan, affectionately known to comrades and enemies alike as Valu. So Valu teaches sociology at Warwick, and he published his book The Clamour of Nationalism in 2019. Another really wonderful work that you should go out and buy or acquire. He's also written really widely on a number of themes, including particularly racism and nationalism. So I think I'll just hand straight over to Sita for a kind of 10-minute intervention, approximately, to get us thinking.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for that very kind introduction. I just want to say thanks to the World Transformed for the invitation. It's so important that we have these spaces to meet in person, to be able to speak to each other properly as comrades, as people who have kind of some shared hopes and aspirations for a different kind of world. I think it's also really important that we kind of are together physically in these spaces, that we're not arguing or retweeting each other or whatever it is, that we're actually kind of here chatting to each other. I think that's always really generative. So thanks everyone for making it here for 10:30 a.m. and it's the first session of the day. I really appreciate it.
You should be in church.
Yes, well this is church, right? This is church. So nationalist myth-making was one of the prompts for the session, and sometimes that appears to be all the Tory government that we live under is capable of these days. So while infrastructure rots and apparently deserving British citizens die waiting for ambulances, the governing party seems to channel all of its energy into ever more dramatic and ridiculous displays of jingoism and scapegoating. And I think living in Britain, it's really easy to feel that this kind of aggression and idiocy is ours alone. I think there's a certain anti-racist argument, and it's one that I think is not without merit, that traces Britain's current nationalist convulsions to its post-colonial decline and its perennial inability to deal with its recent colonial past. I think there's some truth in that, but I think it's equally important on the left that we reckon with the global rise of authoritarian nationalism. And so we have to think also about the relationship between the myth-making, the functioning of the British state, and the making of profit. So I don't think it's enough to say there's a kind of parochial, sort of psychological problem of the British mindset because of the history of empire. I don't think that's enough. I'm not saying it's not there, it kind of is there, but I don't think that's sufficient. So I want to begin then with that global aspect, and I'd like to start not in Britain but in India. So the Indian writer Arundhati Roy put it recently, what's happening in India is not that loose variety of internet fascism, it's the real thing. And I think by this she means the mob violence in the form of rape, murder and arson committed against Muslims and other minorities. And there was a panel yesterday about how these dynamics and these currents of Hindutva kind of circulate in Britain as well. The violence in Leicester that we saw last year, we've seen flashes of in other contexts, very much part of that. But it's also true to say that this fascism that Arundhati Roy describes is not what is happening in Britain right now, and that isn't to say that it could be. Or it couldn't be. So we have to neither pretend that that's the condition under which we live, nor comfort ourselves with the belief that it can never happen here. We have to somehow, I think, keep both in the room at the same time when we think about nationalist myth-making. So one of the things that the Indian situation can teach us is that race as a category in nationalist myth-making could just as easily be something like religion or citizenship or caste. So what matters, I think, is group difference. What matters is hierarchy. And I think in thinking about the relationship between India's kind of nationalist project and caste, it's very useful. It shows us that while nationalism tells a story about brotherhood, what it enforces in practice is hierarchy. And Valley's work on this is really insightful, and I think one of the things that his book on nationalism teaches us is that the brotherhood of which nationalism speaks depends also on an outsider figure, someone who is beyond that brotherhood, but who is interestingly talked about all the time, an outsider who is incessantly discussed. So we hear plenty more, actually, about the bad guy, about the other, about the excluded person, about the migrant, about the terrorist, about the groomer. We hear all the time about that person, about that kind of monster. And there's a point to that. The reason we hear so much about that, I think, is because the excluded other is crucial to the making of those hierarchies. So it says there's a system here, and you must recognise that your inclusion in that system depends on order. And order depends on hierarchy, and hierarchy depends on cruelty. That's what we're being told. So your inclusion, your safety, your family, your health, all depends on someone else's suffering. That's the kind of gambit that I think a nationalist project has to make, and we see that around us all the time. And so in the Indian context, we can see that the hierarchy of castes, so fully built into the society, might offer some crucial explanation for the speed and the efficacy of the hard-right nationalist project there. So I think that framing I just thought might be useful to kind of put this into a more global dimension, so that we can see the way that the key element might be the making of different groups who view each other with suspicion, that view each other with a kind of hatred, or who just enjoy each other's suffering. I think that's important. I think it's important to say that's part of the kind of structures of nationalism. So I'll move on to Britain, because I know that's kind of really the main concern for us right now in this room. And I think the other, this outsider figure par excellence in Britain, is a single man who arrives on a small boat. He's understood to be in cahoots with, or himself a people smuggler, understood to be kind of a criminal, to be a potential sex offender, and to be fundamentally a kind of scam artist, setting his sights on the innocent British people as his mark. And it's clear that the kind of nefarious qualities of that mythic figure are used to justify forms of cruelty acted against him. Acted against all migrants, either coming to seek asylum or coming to seek opportunity, or both. But I think it's also important to think about the ways in which the myth also depends on the cruel treatment. So the cruel treatment is itself part of that project. So asylum seekers are increasingly warehoused in camp-like conditions. So in Napier, the decommissioned army barracks in Kent, This was loaned to the Home Office by the Ministry of Defence in 2020, and just less than a year later, a judgment from the High Court found that the barracks provided inadequate accommodation, it was overcrowded, there was a lack of ventilation, there was the use of communal dorms during a pandemic which posed a huge health risk, there were massive fire risks and more. And anyone who's ever been to Napier, I know there were lots of attempts to kind of go and show acts of solidarity, would have seen what dreadful conditions people were held in and continue to be held in. More recently, we've seen the Bibby Stockholm, a barge moored off the coast of Dorset, which briefly, but with much fanfare, housed people seeking asylum. It was only a few days after people entered the barge that an outbreak of Legionnaires' disease was quickly found, and the awful project had to at least be paused. And once again, we can connect this to a series of global nationalist currents. So this is precisely the model used by Australia in their turning of Nauru into a massive open-air prison. And I think it's important just to have a couple of sentences, at least from two of the people that were held on the Bibby Stockholm, who said the following: "It's like being bait in a trap. We feel as if we are being hunted by the Home Office when all we want now is a system that treats us fairly, a swift interview, a stable future, and a voice." I think it's important to hear just that, think about that first line, it's like being bait in a trap. So people know that they are being used as part of this nationalist charade, and that is very clear from the way they are being treated as well as the way they are being spoken about. More commonly, migrants are warehoused in hotels. And this is, I think, quite a clever trick. People hear the word hotel and they imagine something relaxed and luxurious. That's what we're meant to imagine. Every time they say hotel, you're meant to imagine that someone is getting a free holiday on your dime. That is the story they're trying to tell us. And, obviously all of the things that would make these hotels have been stripped away. You can't use the gym there, the food is terrible, there's very poor hygiene, you can't come and go as you please. You're effectively in a kind of low security prison. And these hotels have become real targets for hard-right mobs. So in Merseyside, not so far from here, a hotel was surrounded by protesters, and that was driven by the rumour that some of the men staying there had been trying to speak to young local white teenagers, women. And that was obviously playing on the story of the organised sexual violence committed against girls in Rotherham, Rochdale and other northern towns, and we can, I think, come back to the role of that series of incidents in the nationalist projects. So, these prison or camp-like facilities for housing people are spectacular, and they are very much one of those technologies of power that the brief for the event was talking about. But I'd like to just also remind everyone that there are other camps too that we must consider that are no less important to the making of race and the management of economic decline. So migrant fruit pickers in Britain do so living in overcrowded caravans. They are addressed by number rather than name, and they're forced to work 18-hour days picking strawberries for British supermarkets, probably many of us would have bought this summer. And these too are camps. They are not necessarily part of the spectacle though. I wouldn't say they were a secret, but they're held slightly out of view. With our eyes are directed towards the Bibby Stockholm, towards the idea of these hotels, and slightly away from these fruit-picking camps. And Christine Snell, who was an active Brexit supporter and owner of a soft fruit farm, said, "I prefer non-EU workers, because if they don't like conditions here, they can't change. Their visa keeps them on my farm." So they're not hiding this. This is all very out in the open, if we care to look for it. So if we think about these two camp-like structures together, I think we can get a beginning of a sense of how the border regime and nationalist myth-making work in practice. So the conditions of extracting labour, of making profit, are connected to, but are not one and the same as the myth-making. So the spectacle around small boats, the scapegoating of migrants, the moral panics about young single men, they're not merely rhetoric, because you can't believe that, they have real consequences. They are used to justify these prison camps like Napier Barracks and the Bibby Stockholm. But I do think we also get a fuller picture when we look at the relationship between movement, labour and profit too. So if we do that, it becomes much clearer that the aim of all the jingoism and scapegoating and cruelty is not to stop migration, as we are told. They can shout and close the borders all they want, but in fact, what they are doing is having greater control over labour and the ability to extract profit. So the treatment of these groups of migrants, sorry, what was it? Sorry, the treatment of these groups of migrants on keeping these separate, right? So we're kind of been told that we have to keep these two types of camps separate, but also that we have to keep these groups of people separate from the British public, whether in highly publicised ways or whether in more hidden ways. And that separation is important in making sure they cannot find common cause with each other or with the wider exploited and mistreated population. So one task of the left, and this is my socialist rallying cry, is to try and resolve that separation.
Okay, thank you, Sita. Is this still on? Yeah, okay. Really, really wonderful start, which has taken us from, the kind of international dimensions, similarities, differences, and connections with the context of India through to an appeal to understand how, these racializing spaces of migration really serve to cheapen labour. So thinking about the value of labour and the role that serves within our economy. So now I'll pass over to Valu to take us forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really wish I gave that talk instead of the one I'm about to give. I am from Sri Lanka. I write on China sometimes, I write on India and so on. But today I am going to be parochially British Little Englander, and it'll be very much about England. So I suppose, unfortunately, my work is very much about the reconsolidation of a sweeping brand, and for now at least, electorally triumphant brand of British, but to be honest, and I just gave a talk in Glasgow and one had to be very careful, and in actuality it's English nationalism that we're reckoning with here. English nationalism, unfortunately, as you put far too poignantly, to be honest, that is now embarking on such intense forms of anti-migrant bordering and fortification that indeed, and demagoguery, that it indeed kind of threatens to renege on any even residual possibility of asylum to this country. I say that as someone whose father, as it happens, was granted asylum, albeit in Sweden. But via him, there was some personal stakes personal fates at stake too. I was going to say a couple of things, but Sita's already put it so well, so I just crossed it all out, as you can see. But so what I will do maybe, the charge sheet of English nationalism's kind of colonial and racial ills would constitute such a tome in itself that I think would take up all our time. So really, I'll skip a couple of things and actually just try to dwell on a couple of things that have perhaps actually changed of late, meaningfully. And actually require our attention so that we may better avoid, I think, and I think we address ourselves as an unholy gathering of lefties, metropolitan lefties, or whatever other choice citizens of Norway and everything that you otherwise might be. But nonetheless, if we do want to affect something, there are a couple very awkward traps that have been laid in our path that I do think warrant some attention today in terms of the thematic remit Lisa sketched out. So, let us start with the elephant in the room. If we're really taking stock of the last 30 years, I do think it becomes particularly salutary to note the less than pale complexion of our governing front bench, okay? The active, not passive, active place of black and brown demagogues as emphatic innovators of a post-Brexit, UKIPified new right. It's a new right being hamstrung by the kind of Thatcherite cadres who still reign supreme in the Tory party. But it's not meant to be. The new right's meant to splinter and become its own proper faction, as we see elsewhere in the world. I hasten to add that the presence of such non-white cabinet headliners can no longer be credibly dismissed as merely some kind of tokenism. I mean, if it is indeed tokenism, we talked about this before, I mean, they're doing an awful lot of it, quite frankly. Did you understand? Like, it's a windfall of tokens. Like I said this to you before, the master puppeteer of the Tory party is just misplace their dictionary definition of what a token really is, you know, and they've gone to town, so in some kind of hubris or some kind of delirium. So rather, more accurately, the cabinet, our prime minister certainly, for now anyways, our prime minister for now, and actually some recent aspects of recent electoral and referendum voting patterns actually happen to be usually domiciled in Birmingham. And so Birmingham, the Greater Midlands has, or the West Midlands have some kind of interesting features here. Majority, minority city, voted Brexit, so on and so on. But I think all of that actually can, instead of tokenism, can be much better construed as essentially an emergent, as a microcosm, a metonym, if you like, of an emergent reconstitution of a politics of British narcissism, provincialism, parochialism, but also fortified anti-migrant cruelty in ways that clearly threaten to exceed all of this being simply chalked up as another recidivist whiteness. Okay? Or to put much more colloquially, and I can't cite their book enough, Empire Endgame is fantastic. We have one of their more illustrious headliners or authors here today. And they not only put what I would like to say in far more sophisticated ways, but also rather more accessible ways. I think I already said recidivism, metonym, or whatever. It's not working out well. But you know, as they say, the task of anti-racism is not to analytically deny the ways in which someone like Preeti Patel, I suppose we should say Suella Braverman now, but I prefer saying Preeti Patel. It has nice alliterative cadence. Yeah, Suella Braverman, I struggle even with the Braverman. I don't know how you say it. You know, the task is not to deny how they represent a multiracial set of entry points in the politics of what can only be described as cruel Britannia, but the task really is to adapt their anti-racism so they can better foresee and reckon with that emergent 21st century likelihood, and not take, therefore, I'm not trying to say that there is no meaning in talking about these things, but not take perhaps excessively simplistic, in part anachronistic binary comforts in all of this being chalked up easily to schemas of white and non-white. And instead better appreciate that emergent, as we enter kind of certain emergent coordinates of a kind of 21st century racial capitalism, and I think you've noted that very well towards the end, and certainly racial capitalism's extraordinarily overdetermined emphasis or overdetermination of the border as its key instrument, but also as its chief cultural and political, imaginative and cultural preoccupation, then we see actually moderately, sufficiently different permutations of who is partially inside and who is partially outside. And where indeed, in part, multiracial forms of nationalized political desire can take shape, and upon which experimentally post-liberal, as you're talking about, visa-bonded, migrant labor being a form of visa-bonded. We used to have a word for that, something akin to indenture. We know how it's been rehearsed elsewhere, and we know that's going to become far more prominent here, particularly outside the more visual spectacle of what we're dealing. The visual spectacle is the red meat for the base. Racial capitalism plays out in the dormitories and visa index work regimes after liberalism. There's no longer that kind of territoriality under some liberal decadent form obtains rights. Territoriality is now conditioned. You come, you stay 6 months, leave, don't get pregnant, that will be checked. Just like we've seen already rehearsed in the Gulf, Singapore, Malaysia. I was in Malaysia recently. Very much, there are different lines. I was going on one line and said, nah man, you look too good. Like, what do you mean? I don't mean good like this, but you know, like dressed too well. They're like, you're on the other queue. This is migrant labor, workers. And it was, the infrastructure started from the moment you enter the airport. Anyways, we'll talk about that later. But nonetheless, so experimentally post-liberal and certainly emphatically exploitative kind of migrant labor visa regimes and stratifications can be staked and routinized upon what is, in fact, in my opinion, an emergent multiracial form of nationalized legitimacy. Am I okay on time? No, not really.
Yeah.
One more point.
I'm soft sharing. It's fine.
You know, I've taught a couple of people here. You know, they know I do 3-hour lectures, and I'm still not on time. You know that? Still not on time. You know that. Okay, one more point. And notwithstanding this kind of above diversification, if you like, of a nationalist conservatism, I do actually think we should pay some passing attention, if we want to, because we will talk about these things, about the shifting poetics of reactionary whiteness itself. Namely, we might want to observe how a whiteness as anchored to English belonging is increasingly less formally about privilege and superiority, and much more about a resentful, revanchist, mournful melancholia. In other words, as Western economies, and certainly the extraordinarily sorry parlous state of our own British economy, I mean, to use a very Marxist language, because I gather you're of that shade, there is no one attending here to the collective rationality of capital, what we used to talk about. That some institutional and custodial framework to safeguarding some midterm capital accumulation program, even that seems sufficiently in tatters more often than not. But certainly, more broadly, Western economies, more broadly, I mean, we are experiencing something, incremental decline at the best, something akin to that, what's more solemn or sober economists call secular stagnation. And of course, where the wages of whiteness, to coin a phrase, where the wages of whiteness no longer obtain as readily as before. And therein, we see, in my opinion, textual whiteness that isn't about the safeguarding of supremacy, but rather more worryingly, would you believe, it is something more akin about the distinctly fascist emotional keys and registers that obtain from a sense of thwarted or frustrated entitlement, where we've talked about it before, where the masochism of perceived decline, the self-hatred of perceived decline, sublimates, converts into the externalized sadism of nationalist identity and nationalist authoritarianism and nationalist aversion. In other words, as far as I understand it in terms of my own writing, the nationalism I see in these places in England I don't think it shapes or promises or expects or intends for anything to actually get better materially. I don't think, that's why the Remainiacs got distracted by the 350 million on the red button. They don't know what means it. They don't mean it either, the people who are exercised by it. It's rather about, in my opinion, the righteous symbolic dignity of having one's nationalized pain amplified, visibilized, staged as being the only authentic one, as being the only deserving grievance. So in other words, we have something akin to an uncanny dystopia where one has escaped one whiteness only to thereupon encounter a new whiteness scored by a new set of psychological properties of loss, decline, pain, and festering melancholia. A whiteness that is herein just as dangerous and paranoid, but nonetheless culturally different to previous renditions of it and require therein a different kind of confrontation. I've seen enough smiles and nods here, so I'm just going to say, and as a result, the slightly more practiced language of privilege, guilt, charity, historical obligation, allyship, it's not going to get us very far. Perhaps it never would have, but it certainly won't now. Because we have different schematization of victimhood. They don't think they're privileged. Do you understand? They think they're the put-upon authentic victim. Especially when you do the trek of Middle England. You understand now? It's obviously London and so on, but I don't know. And in this context, I often find that at least my own anti-racist or my own anti-nationalist missives can more often than not be seen geared to only one class of white person, namely white liberals, as overrepresented. Obviously, they're left liberals or whatever we'll call them, white liberals as overrepresented in the professionalized cultural sector interfaces that we most often encounter, for better or for worse, right? I mean, I don't want to be that authentic crap Brexit idiot, but I am actually, by background, working class. But no longer, obviously, I'm very much of a middle class station. I enjoyed accesses, perks, so on. But that also means we most routinely, as our interlocutors, talk to the arts, talk to certain sectors of media, certain sectors of the museum, certain sector of the charity and activist corners, and certainly many a corner of the humanities academia. And when people like me, at least, and this is all about me, I'm sure you're all better people than me. But at least in terms of my own psychodrama, do you understand? Like, I'm just here trying to make peace with my maker and for past deeds and past shortcomings. But when people like me got too comfortable addressing only this one class, what we neglected is the very basic truism that a practice of naming shame, guilt, privilege, or kind of counseling by general fiat decree, an internationalist attitude, was never really going to resonate to the much more expansive classes that constitute the vast bulk of this country. Be it the petty bourgeoisie. I know we usually don't start Marxist conversation with the petty bourgeoisie, but we should. Because remember, the Thatcher, the advent of the Thatcher halls very famous account of early nascent Thatcherism and how the British political psyche was converted or reformulated alongside a petty bourgeois personality. You know all about that by training. But also that new guy's book. What's his name? The Welsh guy, the Cardiff guy. Yeah, it's perfectly decent book. I thought so. Is he? Oh, yeah, whatever. But you know, the petty bourgeois are so trained in a habitual style of always feeling besieged and squeezed and so on, and they're very quick to turn, whenever subject to moral homily, to a politics of defensive closure and innocence. Albeit the actual bourgeoisie, because none of us are ever going to talk to them, they exist in a they're so stratospherically aloof and exist amidst a kind of globally rarefied elitism that they couldn't care less about any of our lives anyhow. Or be it the aforementioned working classes. I know I'm talking very crude archetypes, but I don't think entirely misleading. You know, be it the actual working classes who would, quite understandably and quite rightly, I think, simply assert their own sense of harried and abject victimhood whenever asked to pronounce or renounce their own privileges and debts. And to whom, unfortunately, as Sita's already made clear, and to whom the poetics of today's nationalism threatens to offer a much more dignifying, if ultimately still self-destructive and futile solace. So actually, I'll just end there, but maybe I should also say that, and maybe it'll be a feature of a later discussion, that it's always been important for me, therefore, against these schematizations and traps, that at least in my own work and people I try to deal with and so on, we more purposefully mine and profile the actual everyday class sociabilities and everyday multiculture already available to us, you know, particularly as expressed or routinized in working class life, be it as well documented in our iconic cities, but also more importantly for the current political fault lines in our suburbs, in our provincial towns, and of course elsewhere. And that is to say, to some, a better grasp of how to amplify multiracial class attachments that aren't sourced in apology, but are affirmative. On active affiliation, where the appeal naturally, routinely, habitually, the appeal of nationalized whiteness ceases to be that interesting and is seen to be the corrosive distortion that it is, and where the border is seen yet again as simply another false panacea. Oh, okay, yeah, that's it.
Beautiful, thank you, Valu and Sita, for those fantastic interventions. Yeah, I think I'm probably just going to quite self-indulgently, you know, pick your brains on lots of the aspects that you've mentioned already, and draw out some of those points a little bit further. I'm super interested in what you were saying, Valu, going back to the point about the Gulf states. This is so interesting to me. I have a great PhD student who's working on migrant work in the Gulf states. And of course, you know, their models do come from colonialism, and there's these colonial habits of categorizing people and using that as a basis of how long you can stay and what kind of jobs you can do. But now the Gulf states have become like a model that, you know, the British state would absolutely love to replicate. And what they've done there is totally externalize their social reproduction, the social reproduction of the worker. So, you know, their workers will be born in India or the Philippines using, obviously, the resources of India, the Philippines, wherever. All of that labour that goes into producing the worker, which obviously is not quantified, not valued within our capitalist systems. You know, all of that is externalized. The worker comes when they're fully produced, and then they leave when their kind of working life is over. Again, for another national context to take up the burden of social reproduction. So this is something, you know, that the British state would love to take to its kind of, you know, logical conclusion, I think. So, I sort of wanted to draw this back to, well, Sita, in your book, you have this fantastic line where you say it's through the management of social reproduction that race is maintained, made and maintained at the level of both social structures and common sense. So, you know, I'd really like to draw out these points a little bit further. So can we reflect on this idea that social reproduction is the terrain for race making? What are those? Because it's actually quite rare that, you know, the analyses of social reproduction are brought together with analyses of racial capitalism. And yeah, what does this demand of us in terms of anti-racist politics and also kind of Marxist feminist politics around social reproduction, I suppose? So any reflection on this would be great.
Maybe I'm just going to take the liberty of doing a kind of quick recap of what we mean when we say social reproduction, because like it is a bit of jargon and maybe it's useful just to make sure we're all on the same page. So essentially, everything that we've got to do, everything that has to be done to get us to tomorrow, and to get tomorrow to the next day, and to get you to work on Monday and on Tuesday, everything that is done to make that happen is social reproduction. So eating, sleeping, all of the kind of care, if you're, you know, all the things we do to make sure a baby lives till tomorrow is all the things that is done to reproduce everyone's life, actually, not just the lives of individuals. So the kind of logic of that, the reason that matters and the reason that Marxist feminists have pulled that out is because much of that work has, under late capitalism, or at least under industrial capitalism, been offloaded onto women who have not been paid for that work. So this is the kind of secret second shift that the working woman has always done, where most women have always actually worked outside of the home and then come home and work for free in the home doing social reproduction that gets the male worker back to work the next day. Right? This is a very, apologies for the broad brushstroke, but hopefully it's useful to understand why this shit matters. And it matters because if we don't do social reproduction, everyone is dead. So, like, that is the basics, actually. Like, this is the work of sustaining life. And so the fact that the work of sustaining life, rather than making profit, is the work that capitalism has to hide, that's why this matters. And so the kind of old story of the male breadwinner family, where the wage can be used, his wage can be used to pay for everyone's social reproduction, that was a very brief moment, actually. We like to think about that as something that kind of is the basis of everything, and that we have to get back to it. Actually, it was a brief compromise, only really for a few people in a few countries for a short period of time. But nonetheless, that was one of the kind of key moments in which the social relations that we've got used to were forged. And if we look at how social reproduction works today, it's not really like that. There's almost nobody who can afford the free, paid-for labour of social reproduction in the form of a wife. It doesn't happen, it's not how it works, right? Even if you are a wife, or you have a wife, that is not how your social reproduction is organised. So, it's one of the things that we need to look at is, well, how is it organised now then, right? So, probably you all do all of your own laundry and cooking and self-care and all of that. Probably you all hoover your own house, right? But if you look at something like these camp-like structures or these dormitory structures, that's actually a way in which people's social reproduction is being done at the absolute bare minimum. So labour is being extracted without the conditions to reproduce the self in as good a condition tomorrow as you're in today. So people's health suffers, people's mental wellness suffers, people's ability to support their families elsewhere suffers. So elsewhere in India or the Philippines, that family is also suffering. And so we need to think about social reproduction and race together, because that is actually the making of people's whole life worlds. And so a life world in which you don't have access to clean water, you don't have access to nutritious food, that you don't actually get 8 hours sleep a day, you get 4 hours sleep a day in a crowded dormitory, that's how race is made. That's how a migrant underclass, whose labour is extracted almost forcibly from them, who experience something that the Marxist theorist Claudia Jones would have called super exploitation, that's how that happens. Is you take more out of people than is put back to reproduce themselves the next day in the same condition. Does that kind of make a bit of sense of what we're trying to get at here. So I'm trying to put, in my thinking, I try and put these things together because I feel like that's actually the ordinary stuff that everyday life is made of. And how we understand ourselves and each other is often through that. So we talk about race through mostly things that are kind of about people's social reproduction. We understand race to be made through how people live their intimate domestic lives. So all the stories, oh yeah, they do arranged marriage, so they're like this. Oh, they have matriarchal families, they're like this. That's all social reproduction. That's all a myth around social reproduction, how it works. Not a myth based, not in any reality, but nonetheless, like that's how we understand differences between us. So I suppose that's kind of why I try and pull these things together. Sorry that was a bit messy, but I just thought it would help to get everyone kind of into the same universe of ideas.
I have nothing to add to that. So I'll start with Lisa's initial point and then maybe segue into something around what Sita said. The initial point was maybe I think I'm paraphrasing and then co-opting what you said, but I'm particularly interested, the more that I read the emergent new right, their intelligentsia, and some of their kind of political vanguard, that there are extraordinary ironies, and irony is too literary a satisfaction, but it is an irony, that the shifting post-colonial geographies of this new right positioning, that they actually increasingly say the West suffers Western liberal decadence, that it is liberal fatigue and excess of individualization and so on. And they increasingly make reference to East Asia, the Gulf states, Duterte and a certain kind of vigilantist cleansing machismo, and India's particular attempt or ability to harness through a Hindutva structure a really localized cadre type network chapter of RSS chapters, okay, the longest running fascist organization in the world, but it's really locally rooted at very early socialization outside in the ex-urban or peri-urban areas of big cities. And why I say all that is that, yes, in the 20th century, though Robert Miles, and we all know what race was doing here. It's the migrant labor exploitation, it's a reserve army that can be super exploitable, so on and so forth. But the 20th century and Europe's own confessional late colonial self-identity necessarily compelled it or obliged it to honor some liberal frameworks. That is to say, okay, asylum here too, or some structure of rights that gaining access to a territory and staying there for 5 years or whatever might render you eligible for citizenship naturalization processes. That certain liberal affordances about private rights that you obtain merely by being here. That is what these new right people are saying is utterly exhausted. And in fact, it's the rest of the world, the emerging powers, what some people call the middle kingdoms and the new superpowers and so on and so forth. Not middle kingdom, middle powers. You can see I read too much about China if you know what the middle kingdom is. But that's between you and I. But they're increasingly vivid about we should not have to be hamstrung by this delusional legacy that we have used to self-narrate European or English or nationalist selfhood. And the irony, unfortunately, from those of us who come from other parts of the world, is where the post-colonial now stands not for a glorious alternative horizon of liberated modernism or humanism or radical progressivism, but stands as the hallmark of a much more efficient structure of organizing capitalism through the statist, executive, clientelist decisionism, and through particular regimes of migrant, as we were talking about particular regimes of how you organize migrant labor. And this, for us, is very difficult. And I think that's why it was really good that you started on that topic, that we should de-exceptionalize Britain, think about its new right fascist energies, and where is it finding resonance. Interestingly, because I read all too much about these people, the new right in China and India make common cause with the European lament or the plight or its dirge or its elegy. The very famous theorists, for instance, the third in command in the Chinese Politburo, you know what it is, the standing committee, is Wang Huning. He is a confessed Schmittian. He is a Schmittian specialist. By Schmitt, we mean the crown jurist of Nazi fascism. And he will, in his writing, go, look, Europe is committing self-annihilation. Europe is drunk on individual nothingness, on amoral, commercial rights saturation. They will have to learn from us. And I'm not saying this is true. I think this is myth-making on all sides. But nonetheless, what's interesting is that the new right brigades can find affinities and find legitimacy and find models and find reference points by which they can give definition to their premise in the wake of a post-liberal. Why I say post-liberal? They're starting to write like this. The Tory MP for Wiltshire, Danny Kruger, has anyone had the misfortune of reading his stuff? You know, he styles himself as an intellectual. He is quite interesting, actually. His inspiration is Alistair MacIntyre. I don't know if you know Alistair MacIntyre, but he was a communitarian critic of liberal individualism, loosely speaking to the left. That whole communitarian world in the 90s, Sandel, MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, so on. So they also say there's excesses of capitalism, this and that. Do you understand? So what Slobodian would call diagonalism, these are becoming particularly prominent things. And I think, unfortunately, we don't want to, obviously one doesn't want to, the Gulf world is in many ways building on colonial legacies and infrastructure. But it doesn't really matter to know that. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't matter for them, and it doesn't matter for Britain insofar as they won't, the legitimacy won't be obtained on those terms. And that for me is very worrying. But you know, we shouldn't become too complacent about trying to prosecute 20th century positions and try to reckon with the 21st century contingencies. Social reproduction, I don't know, see, obviously much more expert than I am. I will say this though, when I went to Malaysia to do an event and then I kind of socialized with some of the middle class, shall I say. Yeah, I mean, no one was doing work at home. And I took my partner, so I thought it'd be, you know, I'd put my work and my partner together, it'll be nice shindig. She was like, what is this? No one's doing work in the house, ever. And in the middle classes. And the principal question about who works in your house was, would they be Filipino or would they be Indonesian? Okay, in KL this is. Why? Because one faction of the middle class aspires for a global consumer self-image, so hopefully they learn English. The Filipino maids will teach English. The other faction of the middle class understands itself as Islamicized and part of the kind of Malay Muslim ethos, so they want Indonesian maids. So identity is getting caught up, but fundamentally social reproduction in that middle class, in the urban sense, has been outsourced entirely to whole platoons of migrant availability, and crucially, I was not trying to be flippant later, they are checked whether they are sexually active. I don't mean all of them, it's quite arbitrary, but you know, the legal allowance is there. That is to say, under our watch, under the conditions of the visa, under the conditions of the work contract, you know, all other livelihoods are postponed. So you live in what, you know, I don't want to paraphrase, but you live in postponed alienation, death, in my opinion, in a suspended life in any case. And that is, unfortunately, maybe in other ways, how capitalism will have to resolve the crisis of the nuclear family too.
Fantastic, thanks both. Super illuminating discussion. I think it really drives home the importance of understanding these global care chains, you know, how they feed into economic processes, and really how, you know, there is a hidden kind of extraction of value which is coming through that social reproduction which is done elsewhere, all kind of enabled on racial and national categorizations. So yeah, thinking about what is the terrain that we fight on, really to address that is really important. So I just want to come back to this. This idea of the Black Tory, you know, as a kind of phenomenon of our times. It was only a few years ago, Benjamin Zephaniah was asked a question along the lines of, I think it was about 2018, and he was asked something like, what's the strangest thing you've ever seen? And straight away he said a Black Tory. And now it's like this figure of a Tory of colour has become obviously completely ubiquitous and is a figure that we encounter every single day. One thing I thought was really interesting that you said, Valu, is this idea of that these Tories of colour are emphatic innovators, which is a really fantastic way of putting it. And I think it's true that we need to move beyond these conversations around tokenism, to think more about what this figure is actually doing. But I also feel like, looking at Suella Braverman, I feel like she's never really had an original thought in her life, and there's a whole kind of economy and community which she is like sitting on, which we possibly need to do a bit more analysis of. The ideas that are coming through Braverman, they're recognisably ideas around white genocide, slightly coded. Powell obviously talked about rivers of blood. Braverman's talking about hurricanes and migration, or whatever it is. All these like deeply ecological kind of metaphors which imagine a force of nature. But I think that, the stuff that they come up with is not kind of randomly mined from the past. There is a kind of architecture behind them, which, whenever I talk about this, people send me tinfoil hat clips, because you've got dark money flows coming from billionaire plutocrats, basically, very well documented, going into organisations like Policy Exchange, like the Manhattan Institute. They're all there, shady kind of funding sources. And these are organisations which have been really vital to doing the kind of knowledge work for a racist neoliberal system, and they've been doing that knowledge work for a really long time. Individuals that some of us have had slightly too much of a close encounter with, like Eric Kaufman, like Matt Goodwin, they are doing this kind of evidence making, which is vital for these these architectures to be built, and for Suella Braverman to be able to say what she says, and they. Kaufman was a demographer, so he's using these technologies of race, as we're talking about, which have been embedded within these scientific disciplines, which are specifically, they were designed to measure and to manage basically the racial balance of power across the colour line. This is like what demography was all about during the colonial era. So, they have the tools to do the kind of measurement, even though a lot of their work is fabricated, but to do this kind of plausible work around the measurement of populations and their management. And of course it is really important for those right-wing circles to have a veneer of academic kind of, what's the word? Just believability, It needs to be kind of scientific for people to be able to make their case. I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but I suppose what I wanted to say is, when we're really pushing for materialist analyses of race, I think a lot of people are starting to do really well at connecting race and class, showing that those are very much kind of co-produced. You can't understand one without the other. But there's really not a lot going on the kind of supply side, if you like, of where the material kind of support and structures that the supply side of these kind of knowledge economies, how they're being funded, who's involved in them. And I think it's something that's going to really keep going into the future as well, because you are already seeing Labour politicians talking to the policy exchange folks, you know, who's the health guy? West Streeting, yeah, thank you. So West Streeting is down there, you know, giving talks at Policy Exchange with all these figures. And of course, you go to Policy Exchange, it's not a one-way thing. They're giving you, you know, a lot of priorities and discourses and everything else as well. And they're doing the evidence-making work, basically. So, very convoluted question or observation, but do we need to think a bit more about, push our materialist analyses a little bit further to the supply side, I suppose, and how do we challenge that politically and make this a terrain of struggle? Have you got anything to say about that?
It's a great question, thanks Lisa. I guess one of the things that I think is worth saying is that I don't think Braverman and Priti Patel and whoever will grow out of their heads when we cut those off I don't think that they necessarily need that so much of that kind of evidence base. Like, I think Suella Braverman will just as soon quote Steve Bannon's podcast in her policy making as she will something from the Manhattan Institute. I just think I think some of those guys are styling themselves like something much more Trumpian, much closer to Bolsonaro, much closer to Narendra Modi claiming that Indians invented plastic surgery when they made Ganesh in the ancient world. You know, that kind of mad shit, you know? I think some of these senior Tory characters are organising their stylistics around something much closer to right-wing YouTube in its more lurid, hallucinatory incarnation. I think that's where they're heading, and that's who they're speaking to, and that's the kind of poetics they want, and that's how they want things to sound. Like, they want things to sound like you're having a bad trip, because that's very compelling. So, I think we're closer to Suella Braverman suggesting that we should inject bleach into our veins than we think, because some of what she says does have some of that policy resonance, but actually she would say anything. And there is a constituency of black Tory types or Asian Tories and their white counterparts, there are still some of those left, who will say anything. And so in some ways the supply side might actually be Steve Bannon, and that's a different kind of problem. I think the idea that where Streeting is going to speak to these people is our problem in a closer fashion. Not because Wed Streeting is our people, he certainly is not, but because that is likely going to be who is in government next. So it matters a bit on that front. And so that's a different question of interruption, I think. More because if that's a kind of almost live problem for us soon. Because most of what was said by Suella Braverman in the Tory Party conference, they cannot possibly do. Like, almost 3/4 of what was said by Tories about their plans in recent weeks is actually impossible. They can't do anything. They can do nothing infrastructurally in this country. They can't build a road that won't flood. Like, the schools are made of aero bars. Like, nothing. You know, so the idea that they're going to teach maths and English up to 18 in a new qualification, who's going to teach it? Where are they going to teach it? Like, you don't have schools and you don't have teachers, so much of what they say is not meant to be done, and we shouldn't pretend that it is. It's just a way of talking. It's just a kind of discursive exercise. It's a way of getting people riled up. It's a way of distracting all of us, so we're like, if you did this, it would be like this, but they're not going to do any of it. So we have to kind of be a bit clear, I think, on what they're actually trying to do and what's just very dangerous, but nonetheless rhetoric. Whereas where Streeting going to these people is, I didn't know that had happened. That is really genuinely, like, the Labour Party might try and do some things in power. Probably less than we think they will, but nonetheless something. So I think that requires a different kind of organising, which is really about what we can do to make it impossible for that governing party, a Labour governing party, to implement those policies. Like, that's really a kind of much more ordinary, on the ground, everyday organising in our community's situation, I think. I don't know how we do that disrupting of the supply side, but I do think we should consider from where each of these different characters is actually getting their information, because I think that the Tory party have no, at this point, and when they become, I imagine, the party of opposition, they're going to say whatever they fucking want, I think, and I don't think they're going to care that much about the evidence, because they're really trying to do that red meat to the base. That's my hunch. I may be proven wrong in a few short months. I'll hand over to Valley.
I would second every word of that. One thing I know an awful lot about is YouTube alt-right. It's the nocturnal shimmer of seductive hate. It's something that I can't shake off. And I understand your point, Lisa. I do think there's something ironic or paradoxical in the so-called anti-expertise premise of new right positioning. Still reaches for expertise in the veneer, in the kind of polite dinner table type context where presumably Telegraph readers still want to masquerade as members of kind of respectable society, and kind of it is learned and acquired through statistics, facts, and so on and so forth. So I appreciate, yes, maybe there are some people who are chest-thumping racial nationalists from within academia who offer a kind of premise of legitimation to a particular class, but I think that class is very small. I am much more interested in Joe Rogan. I am much more interested in Andrew Tate. I do think that this expertise class actually exists parasitically, epiphenomenally, on a whole other set of currents that are being driven beyond their terms. That is to say, I think people often say the word grifter. I don't quite know what it means, but grifter means opportunist, right? So opportunism needs a base to land on.
Yeah.
So the base is being formulated elsewhere. The base is being concretized and being given viscous resonance elsewhere. So if we are going to do a materiality analysis, I do think there's something about the end of mass media and the arrival of digital capitalism. That there is something, I take a lot from Richard Seymour's work on this, that if the digital capital is an addiction machine, what is it about revanchist, nativist nationalism that feeds on addiction? It is much harder to do left-wing work, in my opinion. Look here, I mean, YouTube, on its own terms, as an algorithm, should reward anything. You can be a good fire and brimstone lefty, and you should be able to thrive on YouTube. But you don't. So we need to ask particular questions about the digital unit, the algorithmic recommendation system, addiction, flow, virality. I do believe, as Paul Gilroy, there's something about the nocturnal isolation, privation of privatized consumption. That's why I talked about sociability. Sociability for me is the humane rehearsal, the prefigurative premise of all socialist energies. Privatized, atomized retreat is all the inhumane rehearsal of prefigurations of fascist templates or fascist grammars or fascist energy. I wouldn't write a book on that because I'm probably wrong. But I think it's we can work with that for now. Do you know what I mean? Like there's something going on the screen, in private, that we will. And that is materiality, because that is attention economy. It's just chasing eyes. That is the profit margin. That is, YouTube is the most extraordinary digital media operation that's ever existed. I know people think like Twitter or X or whatever, but these are minority pursuits. YouTube is enormous because it's also long form. So that is interesting. So I have a person who was doing research on this. When she interviews people who watch the YouTube, they go, we're serious people. So they're not going to watch Kaufman or Goodwin, but they say we're serious people. She goes, why? Because, we watch 2-hour stuff, 2-hour conversations. They make us look like idiots. You know what I mean? It's flicking the next hieroglyphic haiku of political, the haiku of leftist rebellion. Nah, man, they're on 2-hour lectures, thinking it through. I mean, not thinking through in a vacuum, really, but thinking it through. I'm fascinated by Andrew Tate. I know it's absurd. It's in some ways, it's an energy that is principally oriented to teenage boys. But Andrew Tate does much more resonant work than Kaufman could ever do. And when I say multiracial, nationalized political design, Andrew Tate's that guy. Why did he convert to Islam? I mean, opportunist, is dripping with Islamophobia, is dripping with neo-Orientalism, but he did. And it resonates, it works more. And half his boys are white boy fascists or aspirational favor. They don't mind, they don't see a contradiction, they don't see incoherence, they don't see juxtaposition or surrealism, they see coherence. Now that is interesting. Then Kaufman can come in, you know, like, he will say, Islamic civilization, this, that, neo-Oriental, some shit. You know what I mean? But they're, in my opinion, but yes, for a very select group, the West Street, I think you put it very well. Yeah, maybe when West Streeting shows up, it becomes our problem too. But even then, to a fairly contained level, in my opinion. Yeah.
Right. So I know we have some really brilliant minds in the audience, so I'm going to open it up to questions. I was going to just throw in one more point before we do, because both of you are so great at holding the kind of international within your analyses of nationalism. I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about what are the hopeful grounds of struggle for an anti-nationalist as well as an internationalist politics in the present. And I almost want to come back to this word that Sita used in your presentation. You talked about the enjoyment of nationalism, which I think is something that the right is very good at, is creating these conditions of enjoyment of nationalism. So maybe how do we do that in terms of creating enjoyment in anti-nationalism and internationalism? So to turn over to the audience question, I now have one here.
Hi. Firstly, I just want to second that I think Sita's book is fantastic, deadly and slick. I would highly recommend it to everyone here. My question is that given that the myth and narrative is such a powerful tool for our self-understanding, is there a role for national identity on the left? Is it a tool that we can use, or is nationhood and racial nationalism, are they inseparable?
Thank you. Any more questions? We can take a little round, because our speakers give expansive answers.
That's a euphemism. The West too, yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on the kind of inherent contradictions within neo-fascist thinking, as someone who's allegedly involved in anti-fascist organism. I'd quite like to know if you see any validity in pursuing any sort of intellectual entanglement with neo-fascist ideology, or if actually it's much more important just to deal with the symptomatic impacts of these policies, as you said, like resisting the state's attempts to implement neo-fascist policies on the ground, or is there any like need to actually engage with these ideas as they come and try and tease out these contradictions?
So, did anyone else have their hands up? Okay. Oh, yes. I have so many questions. I will try and ask one. I think at some point you were talking about countries think as fascists in places like India and China, speaking to the ways in which European Enlightenment has failed. And I was struck by how that resonates within migrants that migrated to the UK at a certain point, bringing that back home from very personal experiences, having
uncles and parents that face the National Front in the UK that struggle to walk home from school without having rib cages broken, etc., etc. Lived in East London, very, very Labour-supporting family that saw through the UK's joining of the EU, Romanians and Poles being able to enter the UK because of their identity, and they had to work in the post office and do X, Y, and Z when they had 2 or 3 degrees, for example, coming from India, and the resentment that created, and the push to more right-wing politics. There's a question in there somewhere, but just kind of interested in this idea of how particular kind of migrants have really experienced that kind of European Enlightenment breaking up what they thought they came here for.
So there is one more to say.
Thanks, that was really great. Or the bit I call oversleeping in the morning. I was really interested in the bit you were talking about, the sort of Schmittian influence on non-Western powers, and this idea of the sort of decadent liberalisation of Western society and beyond. And I was wondering about, because you then referenced sort of left-leaning thinking in that direction, and it sort of, when you described it, it chimed with some of my sense of left analysis, which is that we also talk about hyper-individualisation, and you yourself spoke of the nocturnal miasma of the online world as like a fascist thing, but actually, is that not also a form of hyper-individualisation and things that we often bemoan on the left? So I'm just wondering where you see those resonances on the left and what it means for the left's relationship to those ideas that the left trucks and that kind of thinking as well.
Fantastic. So wonderful set of questions. Max, 5 minutes each.
I'll try and be even quicker. I think 3 of those questions are, should we try and understand why people attach themselves to reactionary projects, right? So this question about how the experience of kind of class mobility, downward class mobility, might lead to forms of racialised resentment that make one likely to attach oneself to a kind of hyper-nationalist project that has transnational sort of dimensions. I think that's kind of a little bit what you're asking, if I've understood you correctly. I think this question, like, should we have a kind of, should we try and understand, should we tease out the intellectual significance of these neo-fascist arguments and try and counter them? I think that's also a kind of similar kind of question. So I think in some ways the question is, do we try and understand our enemies, or is it catching? Like, if we listen to them and speak to them, will we catch it? And I actually really understand that feeling. I think that's a genuine article, sincere, authentic feeling that many of us have. Like, that there is something about trying to get into the mindset of reactionary politics that feels almost dangerous and nauseating, I think. And I think actually what we need to do is allow ourselves to do that so that we can try and understand what does make someone attach themselves to those politics, so that we can counter it in ways that aren't just like debunking. Because that experience, it cannot be debunked. You cannot say to someone, well, actually, it's this, here's the rational... It's not going to work. We have to also address the emotional coordinates and the social coordinates that produce this. And so I think that the reason to engage is not to do a kind of minute line-by-line analysis. That's a waste of time. Like, a line-by-line analysis of Steve Bannon's going to just, like, bore the pants off you. But it is worth saying, why does this speak to people? And I think some of it is that the reactionary right speak across the entire moral register. So we speak mostly about equality and about fairness. There's a quite boring kind of liberal writer called Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book about all of this called The Moral Mind. And it's all very liberal, he worked for Obama, but like, it's also useful to think, actually, yeah, they speak across the whole spectrum of morality, and sometimes we speak a lot about fairness and a lot about equality, but we don't speak about people's other deeply held beliefs. People want a feeling of order, and if we don't offer, I don't mean a feeling of like military order, I mean a feeling that the world might be able to be resolved in a way that's not chaos. So I think we need to think about how we can speak to that without speaking on their territory, without speaking to their theme. So I don't think there is a kind of left nationalism possible in Britain. I think, is that, do I support the liberation of Palestinian people through the project for nationalism? Of course, it would be ridiculous in this moment not to. And we can talk about what happens when oppressed nations achieve statehood. That's a different question, and one that we'll have to all discuss at some point, hopefully soon. But there isn't a left nationalist project that I would put my name to. And I think that doesn't mean that we can't address forms of collectivity, of sociality. It doesn't mean that we can't speak to the idea of togetherness, of being a unit. And I think we have to find a language to do that isn't left jargon. So I think we have to find ways of making people feel included, like they belong, like they have a home, like they have a sense of connection to other people, where we don't use words like solidarity. Not because solidarity ain't a beautiful word, but because we need to find a language that meets people in the form of life they currently live in. And I think that actually that, in a way, I think that's what I would say we need instead of a left nationalism. So we do need to understand why people are drawn to reactionary projects. Not so that we can debunk the reactionary project, but so that we can build a left project that speaks to people's really deep desires.
Again, second everything. See, when we're together, it's fantastic, to be honest. You do all the heavy lifting, and then I can do the fripperies after. I often get the left nationalism question, but I think Sita's already addressed it. But I understand where it comes from. There's this extraordinary Benedict Anderson moment, who is the main theorist of the advent of nationalism. He goes, the left, the great other 20th century program is communism, the communist hypothesis, okay? He goes, the left wants to, it has this rich rhetorical chain, solidarity, collectivity, peoplehood. We talk about all these all the time, we just say it like by rote. And Anderson goes, but they'll never understand nationalism as the first mover's advantage on this. It has a monopoly on affective forms of political community. That it has a ready inbuilt advantage through a modernist archive, through a romanticist archive, and through a demagogic archive. That it immediately invokes community in a way that we don't. We can't. And for me, nationalism is not a terrain for the left to play with. Of course, in the wider sense of resistance, because nationalism is the first movers of community, it will always be nationalism. Fanon prophesizes that everyone in the post-colonial world talks about it. They don't like it, but they know it's the only bequest available to formalize community as a resistance from it. But they don't like it, because they identify, just as you said, the moment that the advent of statehood means there's a whole new set of imperatives, because your struggle won as a nationalist struggle. And that's why I mean nationalism is not an empty vessel. It has its own imperatives. It has its own political desires. It has its own political direction. It has its preoccupation with homogeneity. It has its preoccupation with revisionist history and the ethically numinous past that it understands itself as to be. It has a preoccupation with who isn't in the nation, and it has to rehearse that question. Who isn't of the nation, and what kind of problems do they cause us? It has frontier problems, so it has its own imperative that can't be just recycled all that easily, unfortunately. Or, in my opinion, never. It is always the starting point, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't, but it's almost always the starting point for grand political struggle in the colonial world. But with that, the nationalist imperative in time triumphs. As Hannah Arendt put it, the nation conquers the state. We are talking about that. The nation state, the nation will conquer the state. And therein it sets its own political scripts. The Schmittian and fascist entangled point. Unfortunately, the fascist entanglement point, and it's really interesting insofar as they have made it our problem, unfortunately. Because they themselves present as post-capitalist half the time. So they have entered our fray. And I think that's why Slobodian's book I quite like, this whole crack capitalism thing, but also the diagonalist stuff. A lot of people are talking about this, obviously. But they present on a whole set of vernacular critiques of capitalism. This is not of their own doing. Obviously, early sociology started to do that. Early sociology is a fin de siècle tradition. It is essentially the early conservatives getting angry about modernity. Atomization, the thrust of urbanization, individualization, secularization, and the breakdown of timeless nature and order. They don't all endorse that diagnosis of the problem, but they know those are problems. And the fin de siècle archive rehearse 100 years later what we see now. The same talking points. What they are not is socialists. So that's a different matter. What they are is order fetishists, in my opinion. So interestingly, in Chinese political discourse, high-end discourse, the principle, they have re-excavated through Orientalist terms, in my opinion, a Confucian dichotomy, what order and chaos. Neo-Confucian dichotomy of order and chaos. They go, the purpose of politics is order. The purpose of politics is dignity. The purpose of politics is meaning. The purpose of politics is not equality, not, what's the French stuff? Freedom. And you know what I mean, the revolutionary. No, but it is fraternity, interestingly. Fraternity through nationhood. But it is a much more compelling, everyday, vernacular, small political texture. I think Stuart Hall got this with early Thatcherism. Thatcherism was a market project and a market morality, but he says his legitimating premises is Little England, that it harnessed petty bourgeois moralities as part of the market project. That was short-lived. That was going to be short-lived, but it temporarily sutured a project. But the Little Englander premise endures, and those political ideals have a great resonance, invitation, and reckoning that we need to either disprove or partake with. I loved your question. I don't want to embarrass myself insofar as where does the individual stand. I hate the individual, quite frankly, but I don't want to be that lefty either. I will just say very casually, I think my worst self is when I'm aware of myself. My best self is when I'm not aware of myself. And I think liberal capitalism is a sustained project to make you always aware of yourself. And I don't like it. But I know there are very strange bedfellows when you start talking like that. Ranging from, what's his name, John Gray, that guy, to I don't know if any of you have the misfortune of reading Compact magazine. Compact magazine is a new outfit, which does alt-right themes for the left, or with leftist frisson. And a lot of people who you probably have in mind tend that way. I don't know, and they would say what I've just said, unfortunately, about the standing of the individual. But they obviously won't truck socialism, so we still have a scene. Sorry, I don't know what that is.
Perfect. So, I just want to thank you actually for reminding us of the differences between kind of imperial state nationalism and colonized state nationalism. Not that, the latter is always wonderful, and obviously has its pitfalls, as Fanon says, as we've seen with India, but this possibility of left nationalism, we're specifically talking about the possibilities of left nationalism in an imperial state in this context, and that's really important. And nationalism is always going to mean some form of working class alignment with ruling class priorities and projects. So there's always going to be a dilution of class struggle with any sort of idea around left nationalism. So it's important to think about how this works against class struggle, and especially the internationalist class struggle. Marx said, "Workers of the world unite," and it's really important to keep that in mind. That it's the workers of the world, workers very broadly conceived, that we should be kind of focusing on. I think we can draw it to a close there. We're perfectly on time. I think this has been a fantastic panel. My brain is totally fizzing. Can you all really thank the speakers?